In this video, we're going to be looking at the MongoEngine fields that deal with dictionaries. To get started, let's look at some of the wording differences between Python and MongoDB. A dictionary in Python is known as an object in MongoDB, and for those not familiar with a dictionary is a list of key value pairs. So in this particular example, we have a key of A pointing to a value of 99 and a key of my key pointing to a string value of my value. Now the keys in MongoDB are known as strings, which is actually a pretty decent name because keys in MongoDB are limited to strings. You can't use, say, an integer or a floating point value like you can in Python in an object in MongoDB. Let's do a quick overview of the four fields we'll be looking at today. We've got a DictField, which does a direct conversion of a dictionary in Python over into a MongoDB object. It does a fairly decent job. The biggest restriction being, of course, is that the keys must all be strings. Even though a dictionary in Python does allow for any immutable object, it has to be a string for this to work. Values, of course, also have to have some kind of matching type in JSON. It does a pretty good job of converting. So a none becomes a null, a true and false in Python, their classical true false becomes a JSON true false, and of course an integer becomes an integer. And it does a decent job, but it can't do everything because, I mean, there's a lot of types in Python, such as trying to pass a function in as a value. Well, DictField's not going to know what to do with that. Next is MapField, which is very similar to DictField with the sole exception that all of the values have to be of the exact same type. In fact, that's passed into MapField as one of the parameters. And then there's Embedded Document Field, which of course embraces embedded documents, which are predefined dictionaries. They're very similar to documents, so think of having a small document inside of a document. That is the most common way to use MongoEngine with dictionaries, and we're going to go through a lot of discussion about that in today's video. In fact, I would say about 90% of today's video is going to be just on that one field. It's very powerful, has a lot of functions that are very useful, and this is the only field that has its own list field variant, which we won't talk about today. We'll do that in the next video, but it allows for a lot of powerful capabilities that are not available to the other fields. And then lastly, we've got a generic embedded document field, which is very similar to embedded document field, except that embedded document field is declared to be for just one embedded document, whereas in generic embedded document, you can put any embedded document in there. We'll look at some examples of that. Let's go ahead and jump right into DictField. I am using the same program we used in the last video. So we have a famous quote collection defined here as a document that has a series of fields. Actually, I deleted some of the fields just to make it simpler again. But it's got text, author name, year, rating, and rating history. Let's say we wanted to record what the last rating was and who did the last rating. So we can do that as a dictionary. So last rating, me.dictfield. And let's go ahead and use that. My quote, last rating equals, and let's put into a dictionary what we want to store. So the keys, of course, must be strings. So let's go ahead and save what the rating was, the last rating. So rating 5. And let's store the username. So username, again, a string for a key, and then in this particular case we're going to store Joe. Joe is the username. We'll finish up the dictionary. Let's save this and run it and see what we. And here we go. We've got a new object or dictionary inside of our document called last rating, and the username and rating. Notice that we don't get to control the order of dictionaries. That's true in both Python and in MongoDB. So you might notice this was a fairly simple example. We have an integer being converted into a bson or JSON integer and a string being converted into a string. But how do you handle conversions of more complex Python data types and more complex MongoDB data types? Well, the answer, ironically, is not found in MongoEngine. And this, unfortunately, is not documented at the moment. I might send in a pull request to them to add this to their documentation. But the actual conversion is done with the bson library. I'll put a link to this in the doobly-doo. But here, in the PyMongo documentation, we show the bson module that we import. And here it shows how the conversions are handled. So if you've got a Python type of none, it's converted into a null, and a null in bson is converted back into a none. And it shows that it works in both directions. Same thing with the booleans here. And basically, you can find out, this gives you a map of what works and what doesn't work. If you have a data type that's not in this list, for the most part, it's not going to work. You're going to get a type error when you try to save that dictionary. Let's use another example that we can find in here. We can see that it can handle actually Python's built-in DateTime function. So let's go ahead and try using that. We need to import the DateTime library. And let's store when this rating was left. So DateTime.DateTime.now. So it invokes it and returns the current date time in the DateTime format. And we now should have the when field being saved. Let's try it out. And there it is. Now let's look at a map field. Very similar to DictField, except for that all the data types must be the same. Now, clearly I can't use this here, so let's make something new. Let's do perhaps some translations of our quote. That'd be cool. So translations me.map field. Now what I want to do for this translations is I want to be able to enter in the language and then come back with the translated string for the quote. So our target value is always going to be a string. So let's make this a string field. And for a map field, we still store it as a dictionary. So my quote dot translations is a dictionary. And let's do English, which we already have working. And let's do Spanish, this is Espanol. And let's do, I don't know, Italian. I think it's IT. I'll look that up. Now, I don't know Spanish or Italian, so I'll be right back. I'm going to do a Google Translate on this quote. And there we go. Let's try this out. And there it is, a map field. The key here is this data type must always match. That's really the only distinction between them. All right, now let's get started with embedded documents. And I think the easiest way for us to get started is to simply replace our DictField here with an embedded document that shows the same information. So to do this, we first need an embedded document. So class, and let's say, let's call it rating. me.embedded document. Please note there is a difference between embedded document and embedded document field. Embedded document field is where you define the field that uses an embedded document. An embedded document is a class that sits by itself and is usable possibly by multiple fields. In fact, that's a very common thing to have happen. So last rating now is going to be an embedded document field. that refers to rating. And let's go ahead and put in our fields we have down here. So we have rating equals, that's an integer field, so int field. We got username, which is a string field. And when, which is a date time field. And let's go ahead and have that default to date time.now. Notice, of course, just like in when we, because I make this mistake all my time, so I'm reminding myself as well as you. We want to pass in the function name, because if we put in a parameter here, it'll actually invoke the DateTime Now function. And so what you'll have here is the time of when the program started, not necessarily the time of when the document was created. So by leaving it as a function, it'll invoke every time you create a new document or subdocument in this case, it will re-invoke DateTime.now to get the current date and time at that moment. For this program, that's probably not that big of a deal, but if you're running something like a framework like Flask, if you want to store the date time of when the document was created, you want to pass in the function. If you wanted to store when the Python Flask server started to run, then you might put in the parentheses, but that's very rarely what you're wanting to do. Okay, let's go and use this. So we have an embedded document field pushing in rating. A rating is an embedded document. So down here, my quote.last rating is, in fact, set to rating. And then my quote dot last rating dot rating equals 5, my quote dot last rating dot username equals Joe, and we don't have to set when because it'll be set automatically by this function reference to the current time by default. So let's try running this and see what it does. Oop, syntax error. Yeah, just one equals. There we go. And here it is. Last rating has the exact same data as before, but now the individual fields are being enforced by the MongoEngine document to be in the correct format. One of the benefits of an embedded document is it's reusable in multiple places. Let's say, for example, we instead of just the last rating, we want to remember who the first rating was. You could do the equivalent and now I have that dictionary used in two places. Or what's much more common is you might have two collections that share the same embedded document. Let's go ahead and create a class for users, for example. So that's another document field. And a user will have a username. String field. And say a password. And say we want to remember what for that user what their last rating was. So I can actually put in the same type of field as what we had down here. There we go, and that works. Actually, let's move this to the top. so that when Python looks at this class, it already knows what that class is. So that should work. And just for fun, let's go ahead and create both a user and a rating. So let's make a user. And username equals Joe. User.password equals 1234. And user.last rating. And since I've already defined up here this rating here, I can use it in the same spot here. So my quote dot last rating, and it'll fill it with the same information. So let's save this as well. User.save. And let's go ahead and print both of these. So print user.toJSON, make it pretty. Let's run it and see if it goes. Here we go. What we have up here is the quote with the last rating. And in the user, we have, of course, the user and password and the last rating as well. Okay, now let's play some fancy tricks with this. Like I said, embedded documents are very powerful. And one of the things we're going to do in the next video, part 3C of this series, is I'm going to go through and lists of embedded documents. You can do all kinds of queries on those lists that are, frankly, that are really nice. But even without a list, one of the things you can do is you can use inheritance with these embedded document classes. So if I add a meta function down here and I set allow inheritance to true, that makes this embedded document inheritable. You have to add this. That doesn't happen by default, so you do have to add this meta function here. So now I can say class rating. We make a new class. Maybe we are rating with a comment. So rating with comment, and that can be inherited from rating. And then let's add a comment field. And let's say the user has a rating with comment. So, and down here, I can't do this anymore because we're expecting a different embedded document. So this will now be rating with comment. But I can pull from the last rating in my quote. So my okay, rating, username, and when are being pulled from last rating, rating, username, and when. And of course, I need to now create a last rating dot comment. All right, and let's run this so we can see the results. And there we go. Now user has a last rating with an additional bit of information in here. Because we did a subdocument, it creates another field automatically called class, or underscore CLS specifically, so that MongoEngine can identify which subdocument you're referencing. And it did the same thing with the actual original quote. So now this subdocument has a class field as well, pointing at the actual class. And largely speaking, things that are prefixed with underscores are used for internal documentation and maintenance, similar to how the underscore under ID field is used. All right, let me show you something else you can do. Because it is in fact a full class, we can in fact add methods to it. Let's say I wanted to look at this rating and user in a fancy way. Say, let's we're going to turn this rating into HTML. So I'm going to make a new method called toHTML self, and I'm simply going to return a string that's been all fancified here. So close the parentheses. There we go. So let's go ahead and run this, and we can actually use this dynamically in our shell. So user dot last rating to HTML, and there we go. Now we've got this thing rendered into HTML, and of course is it my quote, I believe, last rating dot to HTML. And because the rating with comment in user inherited from the plain rating in my quote last rating, they both have the same method and showing the same information here. That's not a very pretty date, but that's off topic. And let's go ahead and look at the last field. And let's say I want to support a rating or a rating with comment in our last rating in the famous quote. So now I can do a generic embedded document field, and instead of passing on which embedded document I'm going to use, now I can use either one. So if there is a comment, I can pass in a comment. I can use rating with comment, and if there isn't a comment, I can just pass in a regular thing. In fact, I can just save this just like this, and it should just work, because down here I'm creating an instance of the rating subdocument and saving it into last rating. But I could do either one. In fact, let's do it both ways. Here I'm passing in rating. So file, save, and run here. So there's last rating with a rating element in it. And now let's make it a rating with comment. And I don't even have to put a comment in there because it's optional. But now you see the class changed to rating with comment. And if I wanted to add a comment in there, I could, of course. My quote last. What was the comment I was putting in? I said something. Okay, and the last little bit I'm going to show about embedded documents, which is what happens if you add a field that doesn't exist. And this is actually a fantastic opportunity to show you that. It simply ignores it. So, for example, if I change this back to just a plain rating, because if we look over here right now, I'm saving a comment because it is a factor rating and comment in our document for my quote. Now I'm adding a field that, frankly, has no meaning in just a rating. So what does it do? File, save, and run. Let's take a look. No error message, but now my last rating has a class of rating, and there is no comment. So it basically ignores extra information thrown in there. So we've seen the 4 fields in MongoEngine that handle dictionaries. What we're going to do in the next video is take the already powerful embedded document, an embedded document field, and use it with an embedded document field list, which gives you various query abilities that you wouldn't normally get out of a list of dictionaries. So we'll jump into that next. If you like what you see, please subscribe. Thanks.